You feel it before you understand it. A cut on your shin from a sharp rock 3 days ago. You barely noticed it then. Now the skin around it is hot, red, and swollen, and a thin line of angrier red is creeping up toward your knee. There is no pharmacy. There are no pills. It is roughly 40,000 years ago, and a wound like this can kill you. For almost all of human history, this was the reality. No antibiotics, no germ theory, not even the idea that tiny invisible living things were the reason people got sick and died. And yet your ancestors survived, generation after generation, long enough to become you. So how did they do it? How did people with no medicine at all keep themselves alive? The surprising answer is that they were not nearly as helpless as you think. Start with a man who has been dead for more than 5,000 years. In 1991, 2 hikers in the Alps found a body sticking out of the melting ice. Everyone assumed it was a lost climber. It was not. It was a human being who had died around 3,300 BC, so perfectly frozen that his skin, his organs, and even his last meal were still intact. Scientists named him Ötzi, after the valley where he was found. When researchers examined his gut, they found the eggs of a whipworm, a parasite that burrows into the human intestine and causes pain, bleeding, and exhaustion. Ötzi was sick, but he was not defenseless. Tucked into his belongings, carried carefully across the mountains, were pieces of a fungus called birch polypore. That fungus is not food. It tastes bitter and woody, but it contains compounds that are toxic to intestinal parasites and oils that act against bacteria. Ötzi, thousands of years before anyone knew what a parasite was, appears to have been carrying his own deworming medicine. Think about what that means. Someone had figured out, through trial and error passed down over countless lifetimes, that a specific fungus growing on a specific tree would help with a specific kind of sickness. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody understood why it worked. It just did, and the knowledge survived because the people who used it survived. And this goes back much further than Ötzi. It goes back before your species even existed. Deep in a cave in northern Spain called El Sidron lie the bones of Neanderthals, a human cousin who vanished around 40,000 years ago. For a long time, they were imagined as brutish and simple. That picture is now falling apart, and one of the reasons is their teeth. An archaeologist named Karen Hardy studied the hardened plaque on those Neanderthal teeth. Plaque traps tiny fragments of everything that passes through the mouth, and it can survive for tens of thousands of years. Locked inside it, she found chemical traces of 2 plants, yarrow and chamomile. Here's the strange part. Both of those plants are bitter, and neither one gives you much energy. A creature eating only to survive would avoid them. So why were they in a Neanderthal's mouth? The most likely answer is medicine. Yarrow slows bleeding and fights infection. Chamomile soothes the stomach. These were not snacks, they were treatments. Then it got even more striking. A researcher named Laura Weyrich examined another Neanderthal from that same population, one whose jaw showed a painful dental abscess and whose gut carried a nasty parasite. This individual was clearly suffering. And in the plaque on his teeth, Weyrich found traces of poplar. Poplar bark contains salicylic acid. That is the natural chemical that, once refined, became aspirin. This person, in agony from an infected tooth, was chewing a natural painkiller. There was one more thing in that plaque, a mold called penicillium, the same family of mold that, in 1928, gave a scientist named Alexander Fleming the world's first true antibiotic. A Neanderthal, 40,000 years before the discovery of penicillin, had it in his mouth while fighting an infection. Now, no one is claiming these ancient humans understood any of this. They did not know about bacteria or salicylic acid or antibiotics, but their instincts and the traditions handed down around their fires were pointing them toward the exact substances that modern science would one day put in a bottle. So let's reconstruct a day. Picture your band, 30 or so people, camped near a river. A hunter comes back limping, a deep gash across his leg from a fall. He cannot walk properly. He cannot hunt. In a world where every mouth depends on the group's effort, an injured man is a burden. And here is the thing that separates humans from almost everything else alive. He is not left behind. Someone presses a poultice of crushed leaves onto the wound. Someone smears it with honey, which we now know draws water out of bacteria and slowly kills them, one of the oldest wound dressings on Earth. Others bring him food and water. For days, maybe weeks, the group carries the weight of a man who gives nothing back, betting that he will recover and hunt again. We know this happened because of the bones. In a cave in Iraq called Shanidar, the archaeologist Ralph Salicylic uncovered a Neanderthal skeleton nicknamed Nandi. This man had lived through catastrophic injuries. He was blind in one eye. One arm was withered and useless, possibly amputated. He had a crushing wound to the side of his head, and every one of those injuries showed years of healing. He could not have survived those years alone. Someone fed him. Someone protected him. Someone decided that a broken, half-blind man was still worth keeping alive. The oldest medicine was not a plant or a fungus. It was care. But this is where the story turns and where it becomes almost unbelievable. Because there is evidence that ancient humans were not just treating infections with plants and honey. There is evidence that some of them were, without knowing it, swallowing real antibiotics. Move forward in time to ancient Nubia, in what is now Sudan, around 1400 years ago. A scientist named George Armalogos was studying the bones of people who had died there. Under ultraviolet light, the bones glowed a strange yellow-green. When the chemistry was analyzed, the answer was almost impossible to believe. The bones were saturated with tetracycline, a modern antibiotic, present in the skeletons of people who died more than 1,000 years before antibiotics were supposedly invented. How? The tetracycline was being produced by soil bacteria that had contaminated their stored grain. When they brewed that grain into a thick, cloudy beer, they were, in effect, fermenting a low dose of antibiotic and drinking it every day. And the levels in their bones were high enough and consistent enough that many researchers believe they knew this beer kept them healthy, even if they had no idea why. So the very thing the title of this promised you did not have, antibiotics, was already flowing through some ancient bodies, brewed by accident and preserved by tradition. Your ancestors stumbled onto one of the most important discoveries in human history, used it for centuries, and then lost it until the 20th century found it all over again. That is the pattern of ancient medicine. Not magic, not helplessness. A vast, slow experiment run across thousands of years, where the treatments that worked were remembered and the ones that did not took their believers to the grave. Now think about what sits in your bathroom cabinet. Aspirin came from willow and poplar bark, the same salicylic acid a suffering Neanderthal chewed on. Some of the earliest painkillers came from poppies people had used for thousands of years. Honey is still used on wounds in modern hospitals when antibiotics fail. A huge share of the drugs saving lives today did not fall from the sky. They were extracted, purified, and understood, but they were first discovered by people with no laboratories and no idea how any of it worked. Your ancestors were not waiting to be rescued by science. In their own way, over an unimaginable stretch of time, they were doing science. Watching, testing, remembering, passing it on. So when you feel that wound on your leg going hot and red and you reach for a pill, remember where the knowledge behind it truly began. Not in a factory, not in a lab, but in the memory of people who had nothing but each other, the plants around them, and the stubborn refusal to let one another die.